guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Alice. I go by Hello Alice here on YouTube and I make art videos. And today I am finally, because I feel like I've been telling you that I'm going to do this forever, making a tutorial on how I use watercolor pencils. So I use watercolor pencils mostly to sketch or to kind of like lay down like base colors for a bigger image. But I just wanted to show you guys, like make a little tutorial on how I use watercolor pencils, how I blend them, just some little tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way because I used to hate watercolor pencils, like I hated them. So yeah, if you have had issues with watercolor pencils in the past, or if you want to learn some more, or maybe just see if there's any useful information in here, then keep watching. I'm gonna go grab my pencils and let's go play with some watercolor. Yeah! I don't know, I'm really happy today. Alrighty friends, so in order to get started learning how to use watercolor pencils, you're going to need a couple supplies. So the first thing is going to be some watercolor paper. I would highly suggest working on actual watercolor paper, not just like computer paper, simply because computer paper is not made the same as watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is designed specifically for watercolors, for water. It's not going to like break down as easily or as quickly. It's not going to wrinkle as much. It's not going to absorb too quickly. So I'm going to be using the Arteza watercolor paper. It's 140 pounds. I just have a lot of this, so it is really great to use when I am doing demos and things like that, especially as it's pretty affordable and it is a decently good paper. Then you're going to need some watercolor pencils. So there are two brands of watercolor pencils that I personally use quite a bit. These are by Faber-Castell. They're the Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils. They're German. They are beautiful. These are my favorite watercolor pencils. They are just so pretty to use. They blend beautifully. They are definitely more pricey, but they are really, really good. The other option that I love, I use these watercolors regularly. I use these whenever I sketch. They're actually in my sketching kit, and these are the Arteza woodless watercolor pencils. I would recommend the woodless ones the most. I think they are the most pigmented. I think they blend the best out of all of their watercolor pencils. These are great for a beginner. They are super, super affordable. So if you're a beginner, I would really recommend taking a look at these. If you have tried watercolors before, or you are more into or have a little bit more disposable income, these are an amazing option that's just a little bit more expensive. So those are the two brands that I primarily use. I'm sure there's other wonderful brands out there. It's just I haven't tried them yet. So the next thing you're going to need, obviously, is some water. So I have some water right here in my little cactus, can't touch this water container. And the last thing that you're going to want is some paper towel, and I like to just kind of fold it up and have it in a little square next to me. This is going to help you dab excess water off of your paintbrush, which I almost forgot about, ha ha ha. But yes, obviously you will need paintbrushes. So I am going to be demoing using these paintbrushes. These are the Black Velvet Silver paintbrushes. They are my favorite paintbrushes. And I will have links to everything that I used down in the description box if you are interested in checking out any of these products. So there are a bunch of different ways to use watercolor pencils. I mean, there are so many different ways that I could not cover them all in a single tutorial. So I'm mostly just going to show you guys what I do, the techniques that I use the most, because this is how I use watercolor pencils. It's not how you have to use watercolor pencils. I hope that makes sense. So watercolor pencils. Watercolor pencils are basically watercolor pigment in a pencil form. I'm sure there's more technical things to it than that, but essentially that's what it is. So you can draw with them and then you can add water to them and they will get smoother, more pigmented, they will blend, and they will essentially act like watercolors. So that's why I really, really like them for sketching, because you can kind of draw something with them and then later on you can add some water to it to bring it to the next level. So that's why I really, really enjoy these for sketching. So I've just swatched some pencils on here so you can kind of see how they work. I'm going to be taking my number 6 Silver Black Velvet paintbrush, slightly dabbing it on my tissue paper. And as you can see, as I blend into these watercolor pencils, they start dissolving and they just sort of melt away. The blue, you can see the color is getting a lot more intense. And then obviously the more water that you add, the lighter the pigment will be, just like in regular watercolor. So these top 3 are the Albrecht Durer ones. As you can see, they blend away really, really nicely. The bottom ones are the Arteza Woodless watercolor pencils. They don't blend away quite as well. They do leave a little bit of texture, but definitely not too much, and especially for the price, that's why I really like them. This red is nice too. So that's basically what watercolor pencils are, if you've never used them before. So how do we use them most effectively? So the first thing that I want to talk about is blending. So I'm going to start with just one pencil, not blending color into color. And I'm just going to kind of... So the first part about using watercolor pencils is that it's going to reflect what you do with the actual pencil. So you can't rely just on water, you have to use your own pencil skills as well. So obviously when you press harder, there's going to be more pigment on the paper, it's going to be a more saturated and darker color, and then as you go lighter, you're going to create a lighter gradient. So I'm going to do 2 of these so you guys can kind of see the differences between techniques and what can happen, and how you can kind of fix those things. So when you have your watercolor pencils and you are trying to blend them, the first thing that can go wrong is you just basically draw a patch of watercolor and then you try to blend it out and down. And this is a way to do it, but it's definitely, I feel like, more time consuming and it's harder to get a really nice blend. You have to add a lot of water and then basically move down as you go, slowly reducing the amount of water in there. So you can blend this way, but I wouldn't consider it very beginner friendly. So in the other 2 ways that I've demoed, I have created a blend with the colored pencil before I go in. So that's the first thing you want to do, is you want to create your blend or establish where your values are going to be with your colored pencil before you go in with the water. The second thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to work from the center inwards. So the lightest part, you're going to work from the lightest part inwards. And the reason for that is you're going to have more water as soon as you pull out your brush, and you're going to be pushing into it, into the color. That's going to give you a better blend and a smoother gradient than if you're trying to pull outwards. And it's easier for you to control how concentrated it is at the top. So if you compare what I just did to the swatch over here, you can see how this really doesn't have that much concentrated pigment at the top, even though I did press pretty hard with the pencil. And the way it fades, it's just kind of like one color, one color, one color, oh, it's gone. Over here, you have a much nicer fade and you have much more of a concentrated color at the top. So if you have the fade but you go down, you don't get the same effect. As you can see, wherever I've started the color from, that's going to be where the most water is. So by blending downwards instead, starting from the top and going to the bottom, I've completely ruined my fade. And that's why one of the biggest things is simply starting from the lightest area. You always want to start from the lightest area and work outwards. So the same principle is going to essentially apply when you're blending colors into colors. So I'm going to blend these 2 colors into one another, and I'm going to start by creating a gradient with the pencil itself of the darkest color. I'm not going to fade it fully to white because I'm going to be fading it into this. And then I'm going to start again with the darker, harder pressed part. I think just for me, it's easier to start dark and then go lighter, start with harder pressure, then go lighter, than to come in with a lighter pressure to begin with. I just find it's easier to control the pressure that way. When I'm putting on the colored pencil, I'm using really small kind of circular motions to create a nice even blend. And I kind of do the same thing with my brush as well when I'm blending it. I kind of use small circular motions to blend everything into one another. So the same principle is going to apply here. You're going to start at the lightest and then work your way outwards. So start in the center, work out. Now the more water that I have on my brush when I start, the lighter the center is going to be, because the water is going to push away the pigment. So I'm going to do 1/2 of this having a lot of water, too much water on my brush, and you'll see how it just dilutes the pigment way too much. I have no real control over what's happening. Everything's just puddling together and making a really big mess. and my colors have gotten so diluted that they're extremely pastel. So you don't want to have too much water on your brush. That's why we have this paper towel, so you can tap off your water and make sure that you have the right amount of water. You can always add more water to it later, but it's much harder to take away water because it's already removed that pigment. So in this one I have the correct amount of water and I'm blending upwards very carefully using little circular motions. To do the green, I am re-rinsing my brush and then tapping it off again, starting again in the center, re-wetting that middle area, and then blending down, dragging the other color as I go. This green is kind of a tricky color. It does lose its pigment pretty easily, so you can't put too much water on it, but that's okay. As you can see, again, just small circular motions controlling where I am blending and where the paint is going. Then you can kind of tap off your paintbrush and kind of slowly smooth out some of the blend a little bit later as well. So that's kind of how I blend colors into colors. So the next thing that I want to talk about is how I kind of use this to sketch and how I kind of layer. Because one thing that I find is hard with watercolor pencils is it's very easy for all the colors to get mixed up together and for you to really lose your values, lose your darks, lose your brights, and just end up with a bunch of midtones. So the way that I combat this is, so the first thing that I'll do is I'll kind of sketch something in my watercolor pencils. So I am going to sketch in this light yellow color here. I don't know if you guys will be able to see it, but the reason I sketch in the light colors is that they pretty much just go away with the water and you don't even see them by the end. So when I have my sketch done, I will go in with the colors and just kind of establish the values very, very loosely with my colored pencils. And I may also be using some of these Derwent watercolor pencils where I don't have another color. I don't really like these that much though. I find they don't blend out super well, but I don't mind using them in conjunction with other watercolor pencils. So usually when I'm establishing the tones and the values of a piece with the watercolor pencils, I will start with the lightest colors first and just kind of start, blocking things in. So I'll start with a light tone and then I'll probably jump to a dark tone and then I'll kind of flesh things out from there. Right now, I am mostly concerned with getting in the colors and the values. I'm not really concerned with pressing hard on my colored pencils or, establishing a dark values or anything like that. I'm just kind of loosely sketching things in. And I find it's very important and helpful to be loose at the beginning of anything. You can always tighten things up later. I'm adding in some yellow and layering that over the top of some of these greens and slowly establishing the values so that I can clearly see where everything is when I'm going in with my watercolor, or with my water, I guess, turning this into watercolor. The great thing about this is that if you're on the go, you can do this real quick, and then when you get back, you already have the values and the tones established. So you can go from there. You can, push them even more. But it's a really great quick way to get things down that you can then finish later. I'm a big fan of mixed media, so I tend to use watercolor pencils a lot when combined with other things such as watercolor, colored pencil, things like that. I will often throw on top of them as well. Because they're pencils, it's also it's also easy to get nice, sharp, crisp edges. The other thing to remember is that the color can spread far if you need it to. So you can kind of manipulate the color after you've put it down as well. You're not just confined to the places that you put it when you start. It's just kind of a guideline. So it's definitely easy to kind of be loose with it. You don't have to worry too much because you can move things around to an extent after. I usually will go in with some purples and I will put them in the shadows. It's just going to add depth to your shadows. The thing that I have found personally is I think that it's best to put pretty much all of your colors on before you add water, in terms of what you're going to be doing with the watercolor pencil. I will sometimes go back in and add darker tones later, but I have found through experience that layering watercolor pencil on top of watercolor pencil can be very tricky, and I have found that it is easiest to begin by having things really laid out where you want. If you do want to layer, watercolor pencil over watercolor pencil. Just ensure that the pencil is like completely 100% dry before you put anything down on top of it. Okay, so I have gotten my sketch done with my watercolor pencils, and I feel like I'm at a good point where I want to go ahead and add in water. So I like to work in sections when I'm working on a finished piece like this, and I like to work again from light to dark, but with a few exceptions. So the first thing is that anything that has a hard shadow, I usually go in and I establish those hard shadows first. So I don't actually think I have any hard shadows in this picture, but I'm gonna go ahead and add one in. I'll add it in black. So let's say there was a hard shadow being cast right here from this leaf or something like that. Probably shouldn't use black for this, but it'll show up best. This is why I don't like the Derwent ones. You see that? It just broke on me. You suck. I hate you. And then let's say there's also a cast shadow maybe back here on this leaf back here. So we got a couple cast shadows there. So the first thing that I will do is I will establish anything with a hard edge, like a cast shadow, something really dark with a hard edge. And the reason that I do that first is that way I can wait for it to dry and I can ensure that nothing else interferes with it and messes up that hard edge. I don't want that hard edge to get softened or to get kind of like washed away in the rest of it. So the first thing that I do is I establish the hard edge, but I use the same principles as I used before. So I'm going to start in the areas that are going to be lighter, and I'm going to move to the areas that are going to be darker. So obviously this corner down here is going to be the darkest corner of this cast shadow because it's kind of down among the rocks and hidden by this leaf and stuff like that. So that's going to be the area that I'm going to move towards. And as you can see, sometimes I'll drop water on there and then kind of wipe my brush off even more and just move that water around. And you can kind of see where you can kind of take the pigment and push it. So like this is black and I can kind of come out and sort of do a faint outline of this leaf with that pigment. So that's another thing that you can do when you're first establishing things. Now that I've done that, I'm going to move on to the leaves. I'm going to work from the lightest parts to the darkest parts. And so this edge right here, I want to be a harder edge. So I'm not going to get to it quite yet. I want to wait for this to dry a little bit before I go around and do this edge. That's going to keep it from getting smudged away. So I'm going to start by blending the interior portions. Moving down, and then going slowly and carefully around these rocks, kind of maybe adding a little gap there. Pull up to kind of create a shadow in the center of this a little bit. Now, I'm going to wait to go around this dark edge until I've put in all the rest of the leaves, and then I can go back in on this sharp edge, and that will keep it nice and sharp because everything else will have hopefully dried by then. So let's go in and do this exact same thing with all the rest of these leaves, and then we'll come back and add in the sharper, darker edges. When I'm going in to do the tip of this leaf back here with that cast shadow, I waited to do that one till last so that that cast shadow had plenty of time to dry. That way, adding in the water isn't going to make that cast shadow any softer. I am, however, going to soften up some of this line here that I put there for demo purposes. So one of the things that I like to do is work around the whole piece. So like I said, I work in sections, but then once I've finished this section, I can't go back in and darken up these lines until this is completely dry. So I'm going to move on from this and come back to it later, and I'm going to move on to this next little branch, leaf, stem thing. So these became very, very soft because I created a blend from the top to the bottom. I didn't worry too much about adding in any harsh shadows or anything like that because I'm going to add in texture to it later. This one I want to add in some harder shadows. So again, I'm going to do that first. So I'm going to take this darker section and I'm going to create the shadow in the darker section, and then I'll add in the lights later. And I don't always want to blend away all of these strokes. It's really personal preference, but I like having a little bit of texture in there. I don't want everything to be uniform. I want a little bit of texture and organicness to it. So I try not to blend away the strokes too much. You also don't want things can get kind of muddy if you do that, if you blend away the strokes. So again, working around the painting, I need to wait for this dark to dry before I can go in and soften the lights. So I'm going to move on to the dirt. And again, same principle, and I'm going to combine these two techniques. So for the actual dirt, I'm going to be using more of this technique where I work from the outside to the darkest area and create a more of a soft blend. And then for the rocks, I'm going to be going in and adding in the darker parts so they have harder edges in the way that I did with this stem up here. So you can see I'm always pushing the pigment towards the center with my brush, pushing it towards that darkest area. I'm keeping my whole brush flat against the page. I'm not using the tip, I'm using the whole brush. And then as we get towards the darker areas, I start using more of the end of the brush so that I can control that darker color a little bit better now that it's stronger, and I'm not focused on blending as much but more on creating these sharp outlines where the rocks and the leaves are. You can add texture as well by using your brush in different movements, like dabbing or tapping like I'm doing right now in the rocks. Now my rocks need to dry, so I'm going back into this first area, which is pretty dry by now, and I'm going to kind of smooth out these edges. I think I'm going to have to add some darker colors to this a little bit later because I didn't add quite enough, but that's okay. Oops. See, and sometimes if you add a little bit too much water, that's what will happen. It will lift up the pigment. So that can be annoying, but you can always just go back in and add stuff. Add more over it. And now I'm going back in with that lighter color and just kind of smoothing it over. Blending the lines a little bit. I don't want them to be crazy harsh, but not very much at all. Just kind of bringing that lighter color over the top of it so it just ever so slightly softens the edges. That's usually all I really need to do. Last thing I'm going to do is go in with a very watery brush and just kind of dab it on the lighter parts of the rocks to dissolve some of that color, and then I'm going to tap and pick everything up again. So you can use this the same way as watercolor, where you can pick up pigment to lighten things as well. And just like with real watercolors, once it is dry, you can very easily go back over the top with lots of different mediums. Colored pencil, watercolor, anything that you would like to finish up your image. So I am using some Prismacolor color pencils to define the outlines of this a little bit more, since I didn't quite darken it up enough the first time. And I'm also going to use the Prismacolor color pencils to add a little bit of extra texture onto the top of this as well. Okay, so there you have it. That is how I use watercolor pencils in my sketchbook or to create little illustrations. I hope that this video was helpful for you, either for you or that you learned something. Watercolor pencils are really fun when you start playing around with them. They can be frustrating, but they are also really fun. They are a very loose and expressive medium, so if you haven't tried them, I highly encourage you to give them a shot. The worst thing that can happen is that you don't like them. So yeah, that is pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I upload a new art video every week. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching, and as always, have a great rest of your day. Bye guys!